The harsh and cold mountains of the northern British Isles have never forgiven human frailties, forcing people to band together for survival. In this inhospitable landscape, a unique system of government emerged, one based not on divine right, but on blood ties and the strength of the sword. The history of Scotland's monarchs is not merely a chronicle of the crown's passage from father to son. It is a chronicle of an incredible struggle for independence against a powerful southern neighbour. For many centuries, local rulers sought to forge a unified nation from disparate tribes, whose social organisation and survival tactics closely resembled those of the Comanche or Iroquois tribes. The entire history of the Scottish throne illustrates one central idea. The crown has always been a heavy burden here, and maintaining power required the most brutal evolutionary adaptation. We will trace a long journey from the tribal chieftains of the 6th century to the refined aristocrats of the 18th century to understand how this unique state took shape. The group dynamics of these communities were built on a strict hierarchy and a constant awareness of their own mortality amid ceaseless wars. Power here was not automatically inherited. It had to be literally wrested from the hands of rivals in every new political era. If a ruler showed the slightest weakness, his own relatives would not hesitate to plot a conspiracy and spill the monarch's blood on the stone floors of castles. Our journey begins in the High Middle Ages, when the first outlines of a future united country began to take shape amid the ruins of Roman influence. In the 6th century, the territory of modern-day Scotland was divided among several warring peoples, among whom the Picts and the Scots stood out. The Picts, a mysterious people with painted faces, controlled the northern and eastern lands, fiercely defending their territories against any invasions. The Scots, who had arrived from neighbouring Ireland, founded the kingdom of Dalriada on the west coast, bringing with them the Christian faith and the Gaelic language. These tribes lived in a state of perpetual war, constantly raiding one another to seize livestock and fertile pastures. However, the growing threat from the Scandinavian Vikings forced these disparate peoples to seek ways to achieve political and military unity. Their social structure demanded a strong leader capable of uniting the clans in the face of a common, far more formidable enemy. The unification process accelerated in 843, when the first truly significant ruler of these lands emerged onto the historical stage. Kenneth MacAlpin, King of the Scots, managed, through force and diplomacy, to unite his kingdom with the lands of the Picts, creating the unified kingdom of Alba. He skillfully exploited the fact that the Pictish nobility had been severely weakened following their crushing defeat at the hands of the Danish Vikings in 839. Kenneth MacAlpin moved the political and religious centre of the new kingdom inland, away from the vulnerable western coast. It was he who laid the foundation for the MacAlpinid dynasty, which would rule the united country for the next 2 centuries. Kenneth I's descendants faced the daunting task of maintaining power amid constantly shifting political alliances and external threats. In the 10th century, the system of succession in Scotland differed radically from the European model of direct inheritance from father to son, with which we are familiar. Instead, a complex system of tanistry was in place, under which a successor was chosen from among all adult males of the royal family while the monarch was still alive. This tradition ensured that a strong and experienced warrior would ascend the throne, but at the same time, it sparked endless and bloody internecine strife. This period of Scottish history bears a striking resemblance to Rome's Year of the Four Emperors, when the legions overthrew rulers with lightning speed. Constantine II, a Scottish king who reigned from 900 to 943, managed to stabilize the country and mount a fierce resistance against the advancing Vikings. He carried out a massive reorganization of the Scottish church and army, attempting to create a unified system of governance for all the clans under his command. However, even his long and successful reign did not end with a peaceful death in his bed, but rather with his voluntary retreat to a monastery following a crushing military defeat at the hands of the English. Power once again fell into the hands of ambitious relatives who immediately resumed the brutal struggle for the throne. By the end of the 10th century, the Kingdom of Alba had begun to gradually take on the territorial contours we associate with Scotland today. Kenneth II, an ambitious monarch, secured the region of Lothian for Scotland by engaging in a complex diplomatic maneuver with the English king. He was able to significantly expand his dominions to the south, annexing important border territories and strengthening the crown's authority. But his death in 995 was typical of that brutal era. He was treacherously murdered during a feast by his own subjects. This political assassination once again opened the path to power for an alternative branch of the royal family, setting off a new cycle of bloody revenge. The early 11th century brought to the Scottish throne a figure who forever changed the principles of royal succession: Malcolm II, a cruel and calculating king who reigned from 1005 to 1034, resolved to abolish the system of tanistry once and for all. He set himself a clear goal: to pass the crown exclusively to his direct descendant, disregarding the rights of all other relatives. The grandson and heir of this cruel king was Duncan I, who ascended the throne in 1034 amid an atmosphere of widespread distrust. Duncan I was a young and inexperienced ruler whose reign was marred by military setbacks and a catastrophic inability to unite the nobility. In 1040, he undertook a completely ill-considered military campaign to the north of the country in an attempt to suppress a rebellion by local clans. There, he clashed with the army of his own commander, who had no less legitimate claim to the Scottish crown. On August 14th, 1040, Duncan was killed in battle, and power passed to a man whose name, thanks to literature, has become synonymous with grim betrayal: Macbeth, the Scottish king who reigned from 1040 to 1057, whose actual reign differed radically from the Shakespearean myth. Contrary to popular legend, Macbeth was not a mad usurper who murdered a sleeping guest in his castle. He won the throne on the battlefield in strict accordance with ancient Celtic traditions of succession. Moreover, Macbeth's reign was a period of relative stability and economic prosperity for a country ravaged by civil wars. He generously distributed alms to the poor and supported the church, seeking to legitimize his authority in the eyes of his European neighbors. But the shadow of the murdered Duncan continued to hang over Macbeth's peaceful reign, foreshadowing inevitable disaster. Duncan's son, Prince Malcolm, had been in hiding at the English court for many years, gathering strength and weaving diplomatic intrigues. In 1054, Malcolm invaded Scotland with powerful military support from the English Earl of Seward, defeating Macbeth's forces. The war continued for another 3 grueling years until, in 1057, Macbeth was killed in the decisive Battle of Lumpenen. Malcolm III's accession in 1058 marked the definitive end of the old Celtic system of governance and the beginning of gradual feudalization. The years spent in exile had taught the new king to admire English customs and military organization. After marrying the English Princess Margaret, he began actively introducing southern customs and the English language into his austere northern court. These innovations permanently divided Scotland into 2 parts: the English-speaking lowlands of the south and the conservative Gaelic highlands of the north. The kingdom was preparing to enter a long and painful era of medieval wars, in which England, whose customs the monarchs had so diligently copied, would become the chief enemy. Malcolm III, nicknamed Canmore, which translates to Great Head, ruled the country for 35 long years. Malcolm III was an aggressive and incredibly energetic monarch who launched no fewer than 5 devastating invasions into northern England. His foreign policy was driven by a desire to capitalize on the political chaos that had arisen in England following the Norman conquest of 1066. However, these constant raids ultimately led to the English king, William the Conqueror, personally leading an army north in 1072. Malcolm III was forced to acknowledge himself as a vassal of the English monarch by signing a humiliating treaty at Abernethy, which laid the foundation for centuries of territorial disputes. In 1093, this restless Scottish ruler was killed in yet another border skirmish, leaving the country on the brink of a new dynastic crisis. Malcolm III's death in 1093 immediately provoked a furious reaction from the conservative Celtic nobility, who sincerely detested any English influence. Donald III, a staunch traditionalist and brother of the late king, attempted to turn back the clock and restore the country to its old tribal ways. This stern leader seized the throne, and as his first act, immediately expelled all Englishmen and Normans from Scotland. The Celtic chieftains rejoiced, hoping to rid themselves once and for all of the foreign laws and customs imposed by the Southerners. However, the new monarch's reign proved to be very short and was marked by brutal betrayals at the hands of his own closest relatives. The exiled Anglo-Norman elite had absolutely no intention of accepting the loss of their political influence at the Scottish court. With powerful military and financial support from the English court, Malcolm III's sons launched an active campaign to reclaim their father's throne. One after another, they overthrew their rivals, plunging the Northern Kingdom into a series of grueling dynastic wars. This fierce political meat grinder continued for several decades, methodically eliminating the supporters of the old Celtic system of government. The bloodshed ceased only when, in 1124, supreme power finally passed to the most outstanding of the brothers. David I, a wise and far-sighted reformer, completely restructured Scottish society according to advanced Norman feudal models. He became king in his own right in 1124 and immediately launched a sweeping process that historians would later call the Davidian Revolution. The monarch distributed vast tracts of Scottish land on a massive scale to Franco-Norman knights in exchange for their solemn oath of allegiance and mandatory military service. It was during this pivotal era that the famous aristocratic houses of Bruce and Stewart emerged in Scotland. In the future, these powerful families would play an absolutely decisive role in the fate of the entire independent state. The new king did not limit himself to military and land reforms, but embarked on a large-scale economic restructuring of the entire country. The monarch actively founded new trading towns, which became centres of commerce and artisanal production. By his direct decree, the first Scottish silver coin was minted, which greatly simplified trade with neighbouring countries. In addition, the ruler generously funded the construction of majestic stone abbeys, which became important cultural and educational centres. His long reign was a period of unprecedented economic growth and political stability, finally transforming Scotland into a full-fledged European kingdom. However, the feudal system being implemented required extremely strict control over all regions, which led to constant rebellions in remote mountainous areas. Conservative Celtic chieftains were completely unwilling to submit to the new laws and regularly refused to pay taxes to the royal treasury. A serious internal conflict was brewing, one that required decisive and harsh military action from the crown. William I the Lion, a stubborn and warlike monarch whose attempt to reclaim northern English territories by force turned into a veritable catastrophe for the country. This grandson of David I, who ascended the throne in 1165, spent decades brutally suppressing ceaseless internal rebellions. Having dealt with the rebellious clans, the self-assured king turned his gaze southward, dreaming of expanding the kingdom's borders. In 1174, he organised a large-scale invasion of northern England, which ended in a crushing military defeat. During the Battle of Alnwick, the Scottish monarch was carelessly taken prisoner by the English and found himself in a completely hopeless situation. To secure his own release, he was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Falaise, which stripped his country of all sovereignty. For the first time in history, independent Scotland was officially recognised as a full feudal possession of the powerful English crown. The Scottish aristocracy was forced to pay enormous taxes to support the occupying forces, which provoked a deep and helpless rage. The Northern Kingdom's independence seemed lost forever, and the English monarch dictated his will in all internal matters. The Scots had no choice but to grit their teeth and patiently wait for any opportune moment to regain their freedom. Deliverance from foreign rule came from a completely unexpected quarter when the political situation in Europe changed dramatically. The new English king, Richard I the Lionheart, urgently needed vast financial resources to organise the Third Crusade. In 1189, William I masterfully seized this opportunity. and bought his country's independence for the colossal sum of 10,000 silver marks. This ingenious financial maneuver clearly demonstrated that the Scottish monarchs had learned to exploit the economic weaknesses of their powerful southern neighbours. By the end of his long reign, William I had managed to consolidate his power once again and leave his heir a strong, fully independent state. The 13th century went down in Scottish history as the Golden Age, marking a period of incredible political stability and cultural flourishing. Alexander II, a pragmatic and peace-loving ruler, succeeded in permanently establishing the modern land border between England and Scotland. Upon becoming king in 1214, he relied on diplomacy and, in 1237, signed the historic Treaty of York. Having secured the southern borders, Alexander II continued his strict policy of centralization, seeking to bring the rebellious western regions under his control once and for all. Royal troops methodically suppressed any separatist sentiments, integrating remote lands into a unified state system. Thanks to these successful measures, the country prospered, the population grew rapidly, and trade with continental Europe brought enormous revenues to the royal treasury. This incredible golden age reached its absolute peak during the reign of King Alexander III, who officially assumed the throne in 1249. Alexander III was a successful and beloved monarch whose brilliant military campaign permanently rid the country of the Scandinavian threat. In 1263, he won a historic victory over the Norwegians in the large-scale Battle of Largs. This triumph allowed him to permanently annex the strategically important Western Islands to Scotland and secure its maritime borders. The kingdom reached its greatest territorial extent, uniting virtually all the northern lands of the island under the Crown's rule. The English king was too preoccupied with his own grave domestic problems to pose any real threat to the prosperous north. It seemed that the ruling Canmore dynasty had securely ensured a great and utterly cloudless future for their country for many centuries to come. But Scottish history has always cruelly demonstrated that any political prosperity can collapse in a single tragic moment due to blind chance. On March 19, 1286, King Alexander III was rushing at night to be with his young wife, categorically ignoring warnings of a terrible storm. He decided to take a shortcut along the steep coastline, which turned out to be the most fatal mistake of his long life. His faithful horse stumbled in the pitch-black darkness on a high cliff, and the monarch was instantly dashed to death on the sharp rocks. The deceased king left behind no living sons who could unchallenged and lawfully inherit the Scottish throne. As there were no longer any direct, legitimate heirs, 13 influential claimants to the vacant throne instantly emerged, each actively assembling his own army. Edward I, an ambitious and utterly ruthless ruler of England, had for decades dreamed of bringing his rebellious northern neighbours under complete subjugation. He coldly agreed to adjudicate the disputing Scottish aristocrats, but only on one harsh and uncompromising condition. All claimants to the crown were required to publicly acknowledge him as their supreme suzerain, effectively surrendering the country's independence into his hands. John I Balliol, a weak and indecisive ruler who earned the derisive nickname Empty Camisole for his inability to resist English pressure, Edward I constantly humiliated the new Scottish king, demanding troops from him for the war against France and overturning the decisions of Scottish courts. In 1295, the Scottish nobility's patience ran out, and they forced their ruler to form a military alliance with France against England. Edward I responded with a brutal military invasion in 1296, which razed the town of Berwick to the ground and stripped Balliol of his crown. Scotland was officially annexed by England, and the era of the Great Wars for Independence began. The occupation of Scotland in 1296 was accompanied by the removal of the Stone of Destiny, an ancient relic upon which Scottish monarchs had been crowned for centuries. English garrisons occupied all the key castles, and the local aristocracy was forced to swear an oath of allegiance to Edward I. It seemed that the Scottish state had been utterly destroyed, and its people reduced to submissive subjects of the English crown. But it was precisely at this moment that ordinary people stepped onto the historical stage, whose survival tactics resembled the guerrilla methods of the Cherokee Indians in their struggle against a vastly superior enemy. William Wallace, an obscure but incredibly charismatic knight, managed to unite the common people in the fight against the occupiers. In 1297, William Wallace's rebel army scored a stunning victory over the English heavy cavalry at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Scottish pikemen skillfully exploited the narrow wooden bridge, mowing down enemy knights as they crossed the deep river. This humiliating defeat drove the English King Edward I into indescribable fury, compelling him to personally lead a punitive expedition. In 1298, he led a massive, well-trained army north, thirsting for bloody revenge for his destroyed vanguard. In the decisive Battle of Falkirk, English archers mercilessly rained arrows down on the tightly packed Scottish ranks, inflicting a catastrophic defeat on the rebels. Following this rout, Wallace was forced to relinquish his title as Guardian of Scotland and go deep underground. For several years, the elusive leader of the resistance continued to wage a covert guerrilla war against the occupying garrisons. However, in 1305, Wallace was treacherously betrayed by his own countrymen, handed over to the English, and transported in chains to London. There, he was subjected to a show trial, after which he was executed with barbaric cruelty, his body quartered before the eyes of the crowd. In 1306, Robert Fry Bruce, an outstanding military leader and shrewd politician, entered the historical stage, determined to seize the vacant throne by force. During tense negotiations at Greyfriars Church, he killed John Comyn, his chief political rival, in a fit of rage. The beginning of his reign proved to be an absolute disaster, as the hastily assembled royal army was swiftly routed at the Battle of Methven. Robert I lost several skirmishes in a row and was forced to flee in disgrace, hiding in damp caves on the distant Western Islands. The English occupiers launched a large-scale campaign of terror against the entire family and supporters of the fugitive Scottish monarch. Edward I's soldiers mercilessly executed Bruce's 3 brothers, displaying their severed heads for all to see as a warning. His lawful wife and young daughter were captured and imprisoned in suspended wooden cages, where they spent several agonizing years. At the very depths of utter despair, Bruce realized that defeating the heavy English cavalry in open battle was utterly impossible. Robert began actively employing scorched earth tactics and lightning-fast nighttime ambushes against isolated enemy patrols. The Scots methodically razed their own castles to the ground so that these stone strongholds would never again fall into the hands of an advancing enemy. This grueling guerrilla war was strikingly reminiscent of the military campaigns of the ancient general Scipio Africanus. Fortune smiled upon the rebellious king in the summer of 1307, when the elderly and cruel Edward I unexpectedly died during yet another campaign. His heir, Edward II, ascended the throne, but he proved to be an extremely weak, lazy, and utterly incompetent commander. The death of his chief enemy gave Bruce precious time to regain his strength and unite the scattered patriotic forces. On June 24, 1314, the truly epoch-making Battle of Bannockburn took place, forever etched into British military history. Bruce's small but highly disciplined army came face to face with a massive English force of knights. The Scots, armed with long, heavy spears, formed dense defensive formations known at the time as schiltrons. These living squares, bristling with wood and steel, became an absolutely impenetrable wall against the enemy's heavy cavalry. The arrogant Edward II suffered a crushing and humiliating defeat, losing the cream of his aristocracy in the bloody carnage. The English monarch barely managed to flee the battlefield, cowardly abandoning his troops to their fate. Robert I died in 1329 of a serious illness, having fulfilled his most important life mission. He left behind a free and united country, but an incredibly fragile and dangerous system of succession to the throne. David II, a young monarch whose long reign would be marked by constant wars, exile, and humiliating captivity in England. This sole legitimate son and heir of the great Bruce was only 5 years old at the time of his accession to the throne. The English immediately took advantage of the Scottish king's youth and treacherously violated the recently signed peace treaty. They openly supported an armed invasion and attempted to forcibly place the son of the exiled John Balliol on the throne. This foreign intervention instantly sparked a new wave of devastating civil war between supporters of the two rival dynasties. The regents of the young David II suffered defeat after defeat, physically unable to withstand the onslaught of the English army. To ensure the legitimate monarch's physical safety, he had to be urgently evacuated to France under the reliable protection of a friendly king. There, the young ruler spent 7 long years while his loyal lords, at the cost of enormous human losses, reclaimed his kingdom back home. Upon returning to Scotland in 1341, the now 17-year-old king immediately sought to prove his personal military valor. He decided to actively support his French allies and organized a large-scale armed invasion of northern England. The captive Scottish monarch spent 11 long and agonizing years within the gloomy walls of the Tower of London. During this troubled time, his ravaged country desperately scraped together the astronomical sum demanded by the English for his ransom. The prolonged absence of the rightful king led to a massive increase in the personal power of the major Scottish aristocrats. These magnates quickly grew accustomed to governing their vast estates entirely on their own, without any regard for the absent monarch. When David II finally returned home in 1357, he found a completely different political reality, in which the barons brazenly dictated their terms to the crown. This monarch never had any children of his own, and his death in 1371 marked the sad end of the illustrious male line of the Bruce dynasty. Robert II, an elderly aristocrat weary of endless wars, who lacked the outstanding leadership qualities of his great-grandfather, became the first official representative of the House of Stewart, an influential family that would rule the country for the next several centuries. Robert II's reign was characterized by critically weak central authority and the vast, nearly unlimited autonomy of regional lords. During this difficult period, the Scottish Highland clans finally transformed into truly independent mini-states. Tribal chieftains freely raised their own armies, waged local internecine wars, and completely ignored any royal decrees. The elderly monarch was physically unable to control the growing lawlessness and preferred to remain secluded in his safe, fortified palaces. In 1390, Robert III inherited the throne. He turned out to be an even weaker and physically frailer ruler. Robert III was a monarch who, in his youth, had suffered a severe injury from a powerful blow by a horse's hoof, which left him virtually disabled. Because of this serious condition, real political power in the country very quickly fell into the hands of his power-hungry brother, the Duke of Albany. Deprived of a capable leader, the northern region rapidly descended into a state of complete legal anarchy and lawlessness. By 1406, the situation had become so critical that Robert III began to seriously fear for the life of his only surviving son, James. To save the young 11-year-old heir from the deadly intrigues of the ruthless Albany, the ailing king decided to secretly send the boy to France. However, this desperate plan failed. The ship was intercepted by pirates along the way, and the prince found himself a prisoner of the English king. Upon learning this truly tragic news, the elderly Robert III, already crippled by paralysis, could not bear the blow and soon died of overwhelming grief. For a full 18 years, Scotland existed without a monarch in residence, which allowed the high nobility to cement their privileges. The regency of the Duke of Albany and his son was a time when the royal lands were ruthlessly plundered and justice was meted out by the sword. This period clearly demonstrated the Scottish state's primary vulnerability. Without a strong, almost tyrannical figure on the throne, the country inevitably fell apart into warring factions. Paradoxically, his captivity in England saved the young King James I from certain death at the hands of his own relatives back home. When he finally returned to Scotland, he brought with him not only an English education, but also a burning thirst for bloody revenge. In 1424, James I finally returned to Scotland after a huge ransom was paid, and immediately set about restoring order through brutal means. James I was a harsh and resolute king who was determined to break the backbone of the Scottish aristocracy and reclaim the lands that had been plundered from the crown. His first act was to arrest and ruthlessly execute nearly the entire Albany family, avenging the years of his humiliating exile. James I began actively implementing the English parliamentary system, attempting to create a centralized state apparatus independent of local clans. His aggressive policy of confiscating noble lands sparked panic and deep-seated hatred among the kingdom's most powerful families. James I's actions were so radical that they soon led to the formation of a large-scale plot against his life. On February 21st, 1437, a group of armed conspirators stormed the royal residence in Perth late at night. The king attempted to escape by hiding in a narrow sewer beneath the floor, but the assassins found him and stabbed him to death with their swords. This political assassination plunged the country back into chaos, as the heir to the throne, James II, was only 6 years old. The young age of the new monarch meant that ambitious lords would once again engage in a brutal struggle for the position of regent and control over the state's finances. The main threat to the crown during this period was the powerful Black Douglas clan, whose landholdings and armies rivaled those of the king. In 1440, the regents of the young James II orchestrated one of the most cynical and grim events in the country's history, known as the Black Dinner. They invited the young Earl of Douglas and his brother to a peaceful banquet at Edinburgh Castle under the pretext of reconciliation. In the midst of the feast, a platter bearing the head of a black bull, an ancient Scottish symbol of inevitable death, was placed before the guests. The young men were dragged out into the courtyard and cold-bloodedly beheaded, demonstrating that in the struggle for power, there are no laws of hospitality. James II, a monarch with a large birthmark on his face, nicknamed the Fiery Face, brought the conflict with the Douglases to a final, bloody conclusion. In 1452, the king personally stabbed the Earl of Douglas to death with a dagger during peace negotiations, violating the guarantees of safety he himself had provided. This treacherous murder sparked an open, full-scale war between the royal army and the supporters of the rebellious clan. By 1455, James II had managed to completely crush the Douglas army, confiscating their massive castles and lands for the state. It seemed that the crown's power had finally become absolute, but the ill fate of the Stuarts was already preparing a new, unexpected blow. James II was a passionate admirer of modern artillery and often personally attended the sieges of rebellious fortresses. On August 3, 1460, during the siege of Roxburgh Castle, which was held by an English garrison, the king stood too close to a massive cannon. The gun exploded upon firing, and a heavy piece of shrapnel killed the monarch instantly, cutting his life short in the prime of his life. Once again, the country was left with a young child on the throne, James III, who had barely turned 8. His reign, which began in 1460, turned out to be one of the most disastrous and scandalous in the history of the Stuart dynasty. The stern Scottish aristocracy regarded his favourites as commoners and openly hated the monarch for excluding the nobility from governing the country. In 1488, the Scottish barons launched a new, much larger rebellion, placing the king's 15-year-old eldest son at the head of the uprising. On June 11, 1488, the rebel army clashed with the royal forces at the Battle of Sochibun, not far from the site of Bruce's legendary victory. James III, who had never been known for his bravery, panicked and tried to flee the battlefield on an unbroken horse. The horse threw him off, and the wounded king was finished off by an unknown man disguised as a priest, who had supposedly come to hear his last confession. The new monarch, James IV, ascended the throne burdened by a profound sense of guilt over the patricide, a burden he symbolized by wearing a heavy iron chain under his clothes for the rest of his life. James IV was one of Scotland's most successful and beloved kings, a true Renaissance ruler who spoke many languages fluently, including the local Gaelic. Upon ascending the throne, he quickly proved himself to be the complete opposite of his weak and unpopular father. He managed to reconcile feuding factions of the nobility, restore the crown's authority, and personally suppress the last pockets of resistance in the Hebrides. The king actively developed the economy, built a powerful navy, and founded the famous Royal College in Aberdeen. In 1503, he entered into a political marriage with the English Princess Margaret Tudor, hoping to put an end once and for all to the centuries-old feud between the two kingdoms. However, geopolitical realities proved stronger than marriage vows. When England declared war on France, Scotland was forced to honour the terms of the old Franco-Scottish alliance. On September 9, 1513, the Battle of Flodden took place, where the Scottish army fell into a tactical trap set by the English. James IV, displaying personal bravery but a complete lack of military leadership, rushed into hand-to-hand combat in the front ranks of his troops. The king was hacked to death, and along with him, nearly the entire Scottish aristocracy, including bishops and earls, fell on the battlefield. The tragedy of Flodden left a 17-month-old infant, James V, on the throne, plunging the kingdom once again into the abyss of endless regency intrigues and civil chaos. James V's minority marked a period when King Henry VIII of England began to actively interfere in Scotland's internal affairs. Using his sister, the widowed Queen of Scotland, Henry VIII generously funded pro-English factions among the Scottish lords. For many years, the young James V was held as a prisoner of honour by the powerful Douglas clan, who ruled on his behalf. It was not until 1528 that the 16-year-old king managed to make a daring nighttime escape from Edinburgh Castle and seize real power for himself. James V was a vengeful and ruthless monarch who hated the nobility his entire life and brutally persecuted those who had kept him in humiliating captivity. James V's domestic policy was aimed at the total destruction of the independence of the border barons, whom he had hanged en masse without trial or investigation. These repressions replenished the royal treasury but deprived the monarch of the loyalty of the very people who were supposed to defend the southern borders of the state. The political crisis reached its peak in 1542, when England and Scotland once again found themselves at war. In November 1542, the Scottish army, torn by internal conflicts and hatred of the king's favourites, invaded England. At the Battle of Solway Moss, the Scots, offering almost no resistance, surrendered en masse to a small English detachment. Plunged into deep depression, the 30-year-old king took to his bed with a fever at Falkland Palace, having lost all will to live. On his deathbed, he was told that his wife had given birth not to a long-awaited son, but to a daughter, which finally broke the monarch's spirit. On December 14, 1542, James V died, muttering the prophetic words that the Stewart dynasty began with a woman and would end with a woman. The newborn princess became Queen of Scotland when she was just 6 days old. Mary I Stewart is one of the most tragic and romanticized figures in world history, whose life was filled with conspiracies, passion, and fateful political mistakes. Henry VIII immediately attempted to arrange a marriage between the young queen and his son in order to peacefully annex Scotland. When the Scottish Parliament broke off this agreement, English troops launched a campaign of terror known as the Rough Courtship, methodically burning Scottish towns and abbeys. To save the 5-year-old queen, she was secretly smuggled to France, where she spent her childhood in the luxury and safety of the Catholic court. While Mary was growing up in Paris, a powerful Protestant movement led by the radical preacher John Knox was rapidly gaining strength in Scotland. The Catholic Church had been completely discredited by its appalling corruption, and the people were converting to the new faith in droves. In 1560, the Scottish Parliament officially adopted Protestantism and banned Catholic masses under penalty of death. In 1561, 18-year-old Mary, who had been widowed after a brief marriage to the King of France, returned to her harsh homeland. She was a refined, French-speaking Catholic who had absolutely no understanding of the rough and aggressive realities of Calvinist Scotland. The early years of her reign were surprisingly peaceful, as Mary pursued a policy of religious tolerance. However, her disastrous choice of a second husband in 1565 set off a chain of events that led to her downfall. Henry Darnley, a vain, cruel, and utterly incompetent aristocrat, quickly earned the universal hatred of the Scottish people. Darnley, driven by jealousy and a thirst for absolute power, orchestrated the brutal murder of the Queen's private secretary, David Ritchie, right before the eyes of the pregnant Mary. This bloody incident permanently destroyed their marriage, turning the couple into bitter political enemies. In February 1567, the house where the ailing Darnley was sleeping was blown up, and he himself was found strangled in the garden. The prime suspect in this brazen murder was the Earl of Bothwell, an ambitious military commander who soon forced Mary to marry him. This scandalous marriage to the alleged murderer of her own husband proved to be a fatal mistake for the Queen, costing her the support of even her most loyal lords. The Scottish aristocracy immediately launched an armed rebellion, and in the summer of 1567, the Queen's army refused to fight for her at Carberry Hill. Mary was arrested, imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle on the island, and under threat of death, forced to sign an abdication from the throne. The crown passed to her one-year-old son, James VI, and the country came under the rule of the ruthless Protestant regent, the Earl of Moray. Mary managed to make a daring escape from the castle in 1568, but her hastily assembled army was quickly and decisively defeated. In desperation, she made the most terrible decision of her life. She fled to England, hoping for protection from her cousin, Elizabeth I. Instead of help, she was subjected to 19 long years of humiliating house arrest in various damp English castles. Elizabeth I was terrified of Mary, as Catholics throughout Europe regarded the Scottish Queen as the rightful heir to the English throne. In 1587, after another plot against Elizabeth was uncovered, Mary Stewart was cold-bloodedly beheaded, becoming a martyr in the eyes of the entire Catholic world. While Mary was in captivity, her son James VI grew up in Scotland under the strict supervision of radical Protestant tutors. James VI was an intelligent, pragmatic, and extremely cautious monarch who had learned the most important lesson of his era: a king must trust no one. As he came of age, James VI began methodically building an absolute monarchy, using diplomacy and pitting clans against one another. He was a brilliant political tactician who patiently awaited his greatest historical opportunity, the death of the childless Elizabeth I. He maintained secret correspondence with influential English ministers, assuring them of stability and the preservation of the Protestant faith should he ascend to the throne. By 1603, everything was in place for the greatest geopolitical triumph of the Stewart dynasty, one that would forever alter the fate of the two kingdoms on the island. The English king's dream of subjugating Scotland came true, but in a paradoxical way, it was a Scottish monarch who peacefully seized the throne in London. On March 24, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died, and James VI of Scotland was immediately proclaimed King of England under the name James I. This event, which went down in history as the Union of the Crowns, formally united the two independent states under the rule of a single monarch. James VI gladly left austere Edinburgh and moved to prosperous London, promising the Scots he would return every 3 years. But he kept that promise only once. Scotland became a northern province, which James VI ruled from afar, sending orders via postal couriers and loyal officials. James VI sincerely believed in the concept of the divine right of kings, holding that the monarch should be accountable neither to Parliament nor to the Church. He began to harshly impose Anglican rights and episcopal authority on the Scottish Presbyterian Church, which sparked simmering resentment among the people. However, thanks to his political acumen, James took care not to cross the line, avoiding open rebellion in his homeland. Charles I, an arrogant and uncompromising monarch whose lack of understanding of the Scottish mindset led to the bloodiest civil war in British history. In 1637, Charles I made a fatal mistake by ordering the introduction of the New English Book of Common Prayer into Scottish churches. When a priest in Edinburgh began reading the new liturgy, an enraged parishioner threw a stool at him, sparking a nationwide uprising. In 1638, the Scots signed the National Covenant, a mass pact in which they swore to defend their Presbyterian faith against royal tyranny to the last drop of blood. The Covenanters quickly assembled a strong and disciplined army, completely routing Charles I's weak forces during the brief Bishops' Wars. Scotland found itself drawn into a complex, multi-layered conflict. in which religious fanaticism was intertwined with the political ambitions of the clans. In 1646, the defeated Charles I surrendered to the Scottish army, hoping to appeal to the patriotic sentiments of his compatriots. However, the Scots, having received no guarantees from the king that their faith would be preserved, pragmatically sold him to the English Parliament for £400,000. In January 1649, English radicals led by Oliver Cromwell publicly beheaded Charles I, a move that shocked even his Scottish opponents. The murder of the legitimate monarch compelled the Scots to immediately proclaim his young son, Charles II, who was in exile, as king. Charles II was a cynical and cunning prince who, for the sake of the crown, hypocritically signed the National Covenant, even though he secretly hated Puritan rule. This move provoked an invasion by the English army under the command of Oliver Cromwell in 1650. At the Battle of Dunbar, Cromwell soundly defeated the numerically superior Scottish forces, after which he occupied the entire country, including the most impregnable mountain castles. For the first time in its history, Scotland was completely stripped of its independence and forcibly incorporated into a unified Puritan republic. Cromwell's occupation lasted 10 years, bringing the country strict military order, free trade with England, and a ban on internal clan wars. After the dictator's death and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Charles II triumphantly returned to the throne in London. The Scots sincerely rejoiced at the return of their rightful Stewart king, hoping for gratitude and the restoration of religious freedoms. But Charles II had not forgotten the humiliations he had suffered at the hands of Presbyterian fanatics in his youth, and he launched a brutal crackdown against the Covenanters. This policy of terror reached its peak under the next monarch, James VII, who ascended the throne in 1685. James VII was an outspoken Catholic and a harsh autocrat whose desire to bring Britain back into the fold of the Catholic Church struck universal terror. His utter disregard for public sentiment led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when the English elite invited the Dutch Prince William of Orange to the throne. James VII cowardly fled to France, and the Scottish Parliament, after brief hesitation, recognized the new Protestant rule of William and his wife, Mary II. This decision permanently deprived the senior branch of the Stuarts of the crown, but gave rise to a powerful Jacobite movement, which would continue to attempt to reclaim the throne by force of arms for another century. The Jacobite uprisings relied mainly on conservative Highland clans, which remained loyal to the deposed king and the Catholic faith. In 1689, the Jacobites won a resounding victory at the Battle of Kilcrank, but their charismatic leader was killed, and the uprising quickly fizzled out. The new Protestant government decided to teach the Highlanders a bloody lesson, one that has forever remained a dark stain on Scottish history. In February 1692, the infamous Glencoe massacre took place, when government troops treacherously slaughtered the sleeping members of the MacDonald clan. The soldiers had spent nearly 2 weeks in their homes, taking advantage of their hospitality before carrying out the brutal order to exterminate them. This violation of the sacred laws of hospitality sent shockwaves throughout Europe and turned many Scots against the new authorities for a long time. By the end of the 17th century, Scotland's economy was in a state of utter collapse due to endless wars, crop failures, and English trade embargoes. In a desperate attempt to save the country from bankruptcy, the Scots invested nearly a quarter of all national capital in the Darien scheme. This was an ambitious attempt to establish a Scottish trading colony on the Isthmus of Panama in 1698 in order to control transoceanic trade. The expedition ended in complete failure. Colonists died by the thousands from tropical diseases, while the Spanish fleet blockaded their ports with the full connivance of the English king. The financial collapse of the Darien project finally destroyed Scotland's economic independence, forcing the political elite to face an inevitable choice. Scotland stood on the brink of collapse, lacking a strong army, money, or any prospect of survival as a separate state. England, fearing that the Scots might invite a hostile French monarch to the throne, proposed a complete political union. In exchange for renouncing independence, the London government guaranteed the payment of enormous compensation to Scottish investors for the loss of capital in Panama. In 1707, The Act of Union was signed, which permanently erased Scotland and England from the political map, creating the unified Kingdom of Great Britain. The era of independent Scottish monarchs officially came to an end, dissolving into London's imperial future. The signing of the Act of Union in 1707 sparked massive street protests in Edinburgh, where the common people cried out against the corruption of their lords. Many patriots believed that the ancient kingdom had literally been sold for English gold to save the bankrupt elite. Anne I, an obese and sickly queen, who endured 17 failed pregnancies and left behind no living heir. She was the last monarch of the Stewart dynasty and the first ruler of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Her death in 1714 brought the German House of Hanover to the British throne, a dynasty that had nothing in common with Scottish traditions. The arrival of a foreign dynasty sparked a new wave of Jacobite uprisings, aimed at restoring the crown to the exiled Stuarts. In 1715, a major uprising took place, but it failed due to the leaders' indecision and poor coordination. But the real historical drama unfolded in 1745, when Prince Charles Edward Stewart, known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, secretly landed in Scotland. He possessed incredible charisma and managed to rally an army of Highland clans around him, all of whom dreamed of revenge and independence. The rebels seized Edinburgh in a flash and even invaded England, causing widespread panic in London. However, the lack of support from the French fleet and English Catholics forced them to begin a long and grueling retreat northward. On April 16, 1746, the last battle in history to take place on British soil occurred on the heather-covered moors near Flodden. The exhausted, starving, and poorly armed army of Highlanders was mercilessly mowed down by government artillery in just 1 hour. Prince Charles cowardly fled to France, abandoning forever the very people who had given their lives for him. Following this uprising, the British government enacted a series of harsh laws aimed at the complete eradication of Gaelic culture. The system of ancient clan loyalty was artificially dismantled, and the clan chiefs were transformed into ordinary capitalist landowners. They began evicting their former kinsmen en masse from fertile lands, replacing people with more profitable flocks of sheep. 1,000 impoverished Scots were forced to emigrate to North America to start a completely new life there. During this same period, the surviving Scottish aristocracy underwent a radical transformation, shifting its focus definitively to London. The once austere lords, whose ancestors had slept in armour on stone floors, began building luxurious mansions modelled after English designs. They integrated into the imperial elite, governing the Indian colonies and commanding British regiments, having completely forgotten the independent ambitions of the past. The Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century finally cemented the country's integration into the leading European intellectual context. While the mountainous regions were becoming depopulated, the cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow were transforming into global centres of philosophy, medicine, and economics. Thinkers such as Adam Smith and David Hume produced seminal works that would form the foundation of modern capitalism. Scotland lost its ancient crown, but gained the status of the British Empire's intellectual forge, supplying it with engineers and economists. The history of the Scottish monarchs is a striking example of how geography and harsh conditions shape a specific type of power. Of the 12 kings and queens who reigned from the mid-1430s to the late 16th century, almost none died a natural death in old age. The Stewart dynasty, despite all its vices and fatal mistakes, accomplished a historic miracle. They inherited a fragmented, impoverished, and perpetually warring country on the fringes of the inhabited world. Having weathered centuries of betrayals and humiliations, they managed not only to preserve their national identity, but also, ultimately, to place one of their own on the throne of their chief enemy. The paradox of history is that, in order to save the Scottish nation, its monarchs had to sacrifice their own crown,